Welcome to Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe. From record snowfalls to century-high floods, from heat waves in summer to frigid temperatures in winter, a lot of us are wondering what is happening to the weather. Are we in the midst of climate change, and if so, is there anything we can do about it? Well, there are a lot of depressing predictions, but the David Suzuki Foundation, in the midst of these depressing predictions, is trying to focus on finding solutions to our environmental crises. And with me to talk about climate change and some of these possible solutions is the Executive Director of the David Suzuki Foundation, Jim Fulton, and a former federal MP for the Skeena riding from 79 to 93. So welcome, Jim. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Brad. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. Well, first of all, maybe you could tell me just a little bit about some of the projects that the David Suzuki Foundation does.
Well, during 1995, we focused on several areas, principally fisheries. Over the next couple of years, we're going to continue in fisheries projects, but we wanted to start with a resource issue that had resonance here in British Columbia, but that had importance around the world. Because as we looked at fisheries around the world, we realized that 15 out of 17 of the fishing regions in the world are in actual decline. There are fewer fish being caught in each of those regions in each year. So as we looked at the Pacific fishery and looked particularly at salmon, but we also looked at ground fish and the other traditional fisheries on the BC coast, we got Carl Walters from the University of British Columbia to do some work for us and to look at how could we protect biodiversity and what kinds of changes should we push for in terms of policy with the federal and provincial government and with the industry to protect the fish and to see those stocks come back in greater numbers. So we moved from that study into a look at the world. We looked for successful fisheries around the world that have been sustainable for considerable periods of time. We looked at Japan, South America, Australia, BC, Alaska. We took a close look at the collapse of the Newfoundland cod fishery, and we made a number of recommendations in a book, a workbook, that we feel is really useful for communities to develop sustainable, permanent fisheries where they know what the stocks are that are out there, how much can they take, and know that they're catching the interest of the fish and not digging into the biological capital, which is a very important principle.
Okay, so what would some of the recommendations be then for fisheries in
Well,
BC?
Our first report made a number of very specific recommendations in terms of interception fisheries. We looked at what kinds of fisheries need to be phased down and eventually probably phased out. Big interception fisheries like the seine fishery in the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Johnson Strait. We looked at some of the gillnet fisheries that have continued to intercept weaker stocks once they enter the freshwater systems and once they enter the nearshore estuaries, so we made recommendations on those. And our hope was that by getting good quality information out there, we could focus the debate away from what it has historically been, which is pointing at somebody else, saying that the blame lies with the Aboriginal fishermen, or it lies with logging companies and poor habitat practices, or people dumping stuff in the rivers, or floods. There's always excuses, and we thought, in terms of the fishery as it stands now, recognizing that one of the largest impacts there has been is in terms of logging activity. We've lost a lot of habitat and there's been a lot of water pollution. That clearly has occurred. But in terms of the fishery now, we recognized that because the interception fisheries were taking so many of the weaker stocks while they're taking the stronger ones, that we wanted to make recommendations to protect those weaker runs so they could get their strength back.
What's the likelihood of the recommendations being acted upon?
Well, certainly from the first report, we know it's been widely read. We've gone through 4 complete printings of it. We've had requests for it from as far away as Europe, from the United Nations, from fishing groups all over North America, in fact, around the world. So we know that the kind of approach that we took from the perspective of biodiversity is one that has resonance out there. People that work in the industry know that there has to be change, so they wanted to look at that. So having identified the problem, we then said, okay, what are the solutions that have been working? Why is it that Lake Titicaca, which has for 400 years had sustainable fisheries with no government involvement, how is it that these fishing communities and fishing people have maintained those stocks in such a healthy way? We looked at the Japanese inland fishery. We looked at sustainable fisheries in Alaska. We looked at the Gitxsan fishery in northern British Columbia on the Skeena. We looked at the Skeena watershed. And one that we looked at and have been looking at much more closely in the last couple of months is the Nisga'a fishery on the Nass, where they in fact have gotten involved with fish wheels, where they actually selectively take out the Chinook, and if that's a weak run, drop them back in live. If they want to take some sockeye from a strong run, braille them out live. And I think these kinds of selective fisheries, such as the Nishka one, will be models upon which we'll see more and more fisheries, not just here on the Pacific coast with salmon, but I think we'll see more fisheries going back to hook and line, getting away from trawl fisheries, which are very devastating to many stocks, moving away from seines in terms of most of the interception fisheries. And it's that kind of an approach where we look at an issue like fisheries, we identify the problem, identify some of the solutions, then look around the world, think locally, act locally, and hope that it works globally.
Okay, and we do want to get onto climate change, but before, I just want to add one thing from you said that. That all sounds great. That sounds wonderful if everybody's cooperative. But we saw, you know, the whole conflict in Newfoundland between Canada and Spain and so on, and not everybody is playing by the same rules. So what do you do when that happens?
Well, there seems to be a new mood out there, and I think it's because of what's happened in areas like Newfoundland, where suddenly 50,000 people end up out of work because there's no more cod, and there may not be cod for another 100 years, or there may never be the kinds of cod stocks that we used to have after 500 years of fishing. So people now are being much more sensitive to what serious scientists have to say, and when you get a big block of evidence from around the world saying if you keep fishing this particular way with this kind of gear, you'll end up with no fishery, the fishermen are now quite often the first people to come forward and say, yes, we know we've got to change. What should we do? What are the alternatives? And the David Suzuki Foundation is trying to come up with the second half of that equation, which is what has worked in other areas of the world and how can we make it work for communities here and in other areas of the world. And we've done that now to a certain extent with forestry, with social change, and this coming year we're going to be doing it on climate change, which we're going to talk about. And
right.
also economics and some further work on forestry.
And by the way, just to add that I think it's great to be able to look at these models and see what can work and so on, and hopefully we will work together. But with climate change, when you say climate change, can you sort of unpack that term for me? Because I think of ozone depletion and greenhouse effect, and then eventually it all blurs, and I really don't know the difference.
Well, for many years, Brad, the term global warming was the currency, and that allowed for a particular kind of debate to take place in legislatures and in international forums around the world. There was a group of scientists on one side that said global warming's real, a group of scientists on the other that said no, it's not, this is a natural phenomenon. And that debate went on during the 1980s. During the late 80s, we started to see some international cooperation, and groups of scientists from all countries around the world gradually started working together and set up what's now known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And there are now 2,500 scientists who are permanently attached to that body. They represent the governments of 170 countries, and just this year, 1996, they have come to a consensus that human activity is clearly causing climate change. And while many people have called that global warming, the greenhouse effect, and so on, most people scientifically now call it climate change. And let me just explain what that is.
Okay, but first of all, okay, you explain climate change, yeah.
All right. There's a number of gases that are released. The one that people are most familiar with is carbon dioxide. When you start up your car or your lawnmower or you fire up your wood stove, almost any imaginable number of things that you do that involve the burning or the combustion of fossil fuels, gasoline, diesel fuel, natural gas, coal, wood, all of these when they're burned or combusted let off carbon dioxide. And a good thing to give you an idea of how much carbon dioxide is released, if you burn a gallon of gasoline, which weighs about 8 pounds, you let off more than 16 pounds of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Yeah. And what the carbon dioxide does when it goes up into the atmosphere is acts as a blanket. The sunlight comes in and it bounces off those molecules as it's coming in through the natural atmosphere. But in this case, as they come down through, some of them still bounce off, but when they try and bounce back out again, they bounce off the carbon dioxide molecules again and bounce down again. So you get this blanketing thermal effect. And of course, it's not just carbon dioxide, and I won't bore you with the listing of a long number of gases, but carbon dioxide and methane, which comes from everything from cattle to gas plants to landfills, it's a much more potent gas, about 25 times the blanketing capacity of carbon dioxide.
So you said that they've now come to a consensus that human activity is changing the climate.
Yes.
Is that the main culprit, carbon dioxide and methane and other gases, or do we look at other kinds of human activity? I mean, that's...
These are the main ones. I'll break it down. Let me just break down the three things that are probably in a lot of people's minds. There's ozone depletion, the hole in the ozone. People have been able to focus on that because they know that it came from CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which are in the back of everyone's refrigerator.
And all those spray things,
Spray
products
so
that we have, yeah, okay.
As those molecules went out into the atmosphere, they consumed the ozone layer, which is a very thin layer well out in the troposphere of the planet.
Right.
So as they were consuming the ozone, that's what chlorine was doing out there from the CFCs, we were starting to get these large holes in the atmosphere, and ultraviolet was coming through and causing crop damage, skin cancer. That's probably the most commonly understood thing. Frogs started to disappear. The ultraviolet was affecting the regenerative capacity of frog eggs so that they couldn't actually hatch. So that's ozone. That problem, to a certain extent, has been dealt with an international protocol signed in 1988 in Montreal. 1998, 2 years from now, will be our most dangerous year for ozone depletion. After that, our ozone will start to recover.
Oh, really? So we've been able to turn it around that quickly?
The world community moved on ozone depletion in a very vigorous way almost 10 years ago in Montreal. It was a terrific example of how collectively we can be quite intelligent and do the right thing. On climate change, a lot of people still say, well, what's it really like? And in northern Canada, people say, well, it would be nicer if it was warmer in the winter. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about what the possible benefits of...
And not everybody agrees that it is. Like you said, the human activity is affecting the climate, but I have read reports, like there's still some people who argue and say, we don't know yet. I mean, what's the difference between significant climate change or just normal variations in weather patterns?
Well, the only area now where there is disagreement in the serious scientific community is in how fast we're going to see sea rise. There are predictions that it could be as much as 3 feet between now and the year 2100, which will be a very significant sea rise here in a city like Vancouver. Yeah. There is concern about how widespread drought is going to be, about how intense storms are going to become. But it's interesting in terms of that particular point, the worldwide insurance industry at the most recent meetings on the climate change issue have really come to the forefront and are arguing for substantive reductions in carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas release because they've watched during the 1980s intense storms, excluding flooding, were causing about $3 billion in additional damage per year during the 1980s. By the 1990s, when we've had 5 of the 7 hottest years on record in the century, bang, 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 almost one after another, we've seen the intensity of storms causing more than $20 billion in damage per year. So from 3 billion to 20, you can start to see the intensity of damage starting to occur from storm damage related to the extremes that we're starting to see. Wind speed, the nature of hurricanes, drought.
Oh, we see it. I mean, it just feels like it is escalating exponentially, almost month by month. I mean, you know, with different parts of the world, in North America particularly, you know, hit by all kinds of weather problems. Okay, so if there is this insistence that we need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and so on, I mean, we all want the world to survive, and we all want the best for the planet. We are also very comfortable in our lifestyles and somewhat selfish. So my question is very selfish. How is this going to impact on me and my North American lifestyle? Like, what's it going to look like to reduce carbon dioxide emissions?
Well, most Canadians still have not made the connection between energy consumption and climate change. That really hasn't clicked. When people are driving their car, they still haven't made the connection between putting the gas in the tank, turning the key, running the car, carbon dioxide coming out, going up into the atmosphere, and causing weather patterns and climate to change. The connection hasn't been made, and that's a big job for the David Suzuki Foundation, and we're going to take that on this year to try and get quality, understandable information out on television, in newspaper, on radio, in magazines, and by word of mouth. So we want to make that connection. But we realize that it's going to be very difficult to get Canadians and others around the world to change some of our energy consumption habits. The car, That's going to be very difficult to change patterns. We have urban sprawl in most areas of the world. A lot of people have to commute to and from work. There's a lot of vehicle use that's simply required to keep doing what they're doing.
Right.
There's some great opportunities, though. I mean, right here in our own city of Vancouver, for example, we have Ballard fuel cells right over here in North Van. It's a wonderful new technology. I've been there. I've held one of their motors in my hands. You put hydrogen in one side, oxygen in the other. It has no moving parts. Can you imagine a motor for a bus or a car with no moving parts? And what happens is as the hydrogen and oxygen come up along a membrane, electricity is created, and you have a natural ongoing source of electricity to drive your car around.
And it's non-polluting? Non-polluting?
Non-polluting. Absolutely non-polluting. The only thing that you get out of your tailpipe is atomically pure water. So we can still have our cars. This is a bridging technology. It's widely recognized now that we're going to have to reduce our carbon dioxide outputs by about 80% to stabilize the amount of carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere. That sounds enormous, and it is. And people are just now starting to talk about the reality that we're going to have to stop using fossil fuels and go to other energy sources.
So we're at the end of the fossil fuel era? Is it the end of the sort of thing? Or
we're in a transition. We're going to have to move out of fossil fuels. In some cases, we can strip hydrogen and other non-polluting elements out of the fossil fuel base and use them. But if we continue to build coal-fired thermal generation here in Canada, in the United States, in huge developing countries like China, the likelihood of massive climate change really moves onto the agenda.
Now, okay, many questions. But first of all, I mean, if you're talking about massive climate change, I mean, we listened to Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, warning us about DDT, and we've actually turned things around, and eagles and osprey and so on are able to nest in places where they couldn't because DDT levels were too high. You had some good news about ozone depletion for 1998. Can we turn around this climate change, or are we, is the world so sick from the carbon dioxide fumes that there is something that's irreversible?
Oh, no, it's not irreversible, and I have a very positive outlook on the world cooperating on this. We have to keep in mind, though, the most powerful and most wealthy institutions on Earth want to keep producing and having consumers buy fossil fuels.
But why, if it's going, why would an institution want to do that if it's sort of suicidal? I mean,
well, big oil companies and countries that produce a lot of oil, it's their main source of revenue, so they want to keep doing it. And it's really up to the consumer. Canadians are great on the 4 R's: recycle, reuse, and in fact the most important one now coming onto the agenda of many Canadians is to refuse to buy things that they know are bad for the environment. So while they're recycling and reducing and reusing, now they're starting to refuse to buy things that they know are bad, and they're looking for alternatives. And that's why I think systems like the Ballard fuel cell are really going to start taking off. They're an alternative, non-polluting source of energy for motive movement of buses, cars, trains. A little more difficult at the moment because of the weight and size of the technology for aircraft. But aircraft, of course, are massive producers of carbon dioxide as well. When you fly from here to Calgary, for example, you emit about the same amount of carbon dioxide as a passenger on that plane as you would if you drove. Very few people have made that connection, that a lot of these technologies that seem safer and cleaner are in fact just as polluting as cars or trucks.
Yeah, so obviously there is an economic interest for certain corporations to keep the fossil fuels sort of being used and so on, and governments sometimes go along with that, and yet at the same time we have the concern about the earth. I mean, is there a canary in the mine, so to speak, that can give us a warning as to how serious this is? I mean, what are some of the impacts on wildlife or air, earth, sea, so on?
Well, we're just starting to see some of the more significant impacts. Obviously, the insurance industry would want to be at the front of the line and say, Brad, Jim, listen to us. We see it in terms of property damage from storms. It's gone from $3 billion a year to $20 billion a year. Wake up. The Poseidon satellite, which is circulating the Earth now as we speak, has been taking very precise, accurate measurements of sea rise every 10 days for the last couple of years. And the Pacific Ocean, right here, right in Kitsilano, within a few feet of us, is rising 1/6 of an inch a year now.
Oh, that is substantial, isn't it?
More than double what was expected from what they were reading on the different tide markers from around the world. But that's from thermal expansion. The big ice caps and glaciers haven't started to melt yet. There's some signs that that's starting to happen with James Ross Island in the Antarctic. For the first time in 10,000 years being completely surrounded by water. So there are canaries out there that you can see from space. The sea is rising. We're seeing icebergs the size of some states in the United States calving in the Antarctic.
Wow.
We're seeing islands that have never been surrounded by water before, now surrounded by water. So we're seeing things that we can measure and we can now understand. And the big step now is to get individuals in Canada, individuals in the United States, individuals in Bangladesh, individuals in South America to understand that there are steps that we have to take. We have to start reducing our consumption of fossil fuels in the traditional way.
But doesn't it feel a little bit like, I mean, those efforts make a difference, and I don't want to belittle every little effort that each one of us makes individually. But there is often the feeling in all of this that that is so small and so futile that it's not going to make the difference, that the changes have to be bigger than this. And the other thing is, how can we expect people in Bangladesh, I mean, they're just sort of getting on board with some of these things that we've sort of been able to use and overuse.
Well, we have to be much more creative in a business sense in the kinds of technology we provide to ourselves and to the developing world. We shouldn't be taking coal-fired thermal generators to China and installing them. We should be saying, look, if you start doing that and you look ahead a few years in terms of our requirements globally to be reducing carbon dioxide output by 80%. So that means 4 out of every 5 molecules that we're letting off we have to stop releasing, because the forests and all of the carbon sinks of the world can only on an annual basis take 1/2 of the carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere that we're putting there. Let me just run over that again.
Okay.
In each given year, the amount of carbon dioxide that we're letting off is double what all of the plants and all of the oceans and all of the carbon sinks can take back out. So we're adding a blanket each year, a thicker and thicker blanket into the atmosphere. And the world is going to get warmer and warmer. A 1 to 2 degree rise Celsius in the average temperature of the whole of the Earth will mean an 8 degree rise in northern Canada. And we've already seen another canary in the mine. You asked about canaries. The boreal forest in northern Canada for many years was considered to be one of the largest carbon sinks. It was reaching out in the atmosphere and grabbing those carbon dioxide atoms and fixing them into the wood. And it's a gigantic forest that runs from BC, from the Cassiar, all the way through to Newfoundland. Over the last 25 years, it's been very carefully studied by the Canadian Forest Service and by federal authorities looking at it because it's been a huge fixer of carbon. What we've suddenly seen in the last 5 years is that the boreal forests of northern Canada have shrunk by 1/5 in terms of their actual biomass from fire and insects. They're drying out, and insect populations are starting...
in a warmer climate,
That's
of course,
right.
their insects survive better.
They're really starting to gobble on the forest, and we've gone from a net fixer of carbon, the boreal forest, the largest forest in the world, to a net emitter of carbon dioxide. So there's a canary there in terms of a living part of Canada. As the forests shrink, it gives less area for the natural wildlife, for the caribou, for all of the mammals and birds and so on that live there. So these big changes that we're seeing at the global level, sea rise, and to go back to fish for a moment, as you see the sea rise and you lose estuaries where the rivers come into the ocean, for each 1% of the estuary that you lose 1% of the fish.
And of course, and as the climate changes and the water temperature rises, of course, the habitat for the fish changes and so on.
That's right. All of these things are interrelated.
But now, are the ecosystems adaptable? I mean, because we've always been evolutionary, or is it happening? Is it too quick for some species to adapt?
Well, it's a very, very sharp rise. We have seen in this post-industrial period a much more rapid change in the atmosphere than at any point in the last 10,000 years. We've seen a very rapid buildup of carbon dioxide, and this is proven by ice cores taken in the Arctic and the Antarctic. You can actually see the amount of carbon dioxide now that's fixed in the ice in this more recent period of human activity. So the scientists are on board saying, yes, this is real. The satellites are measuring it saying, yes, this is real. Our forests are going from net sinks of carbon dioxide to net emitters. That's real. So consumers now need good quality information. What causes climate change, and what can we do as individuals? As
individuals, but also in the Rio Conference, the Earth Conference, Summit Conference in '92, passed a resolution saying that industrial countries should go back to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. But it was a voluntary effort on industrial countries, and developing countries were exempt. So there doesn't sound like there's any teeth in that. I mean, individuals we can do all we want unless there's a more collective response.
Well, I think the island nations of the world, I was there in 1992 when at that time our Prime Minister Brian Mulroney spoke very positively, and I supported him totally when he said that Canada should should stabilize by the year 2000 our emissions at 1990 levels. Our present Minister of Finance, Paul Martin, was also there, and in 1992 he released a paper on behalf of the governing party of Canada saying that we should go between a 20% and a 50% reduction in carbon dioxide. And yet Canada's actually going the other way. By the year 2000, we will have increased our emissions of greenhouse gases by 13% instead of stabilizing. And we're already, as Canadians, the largest single emitters in the developed world of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So if anybody needs to clean up their act, it's we Canadians. And there's a lot we can do. There's bridging technologies like the hydrogen fuel cell made here in Vancouver. There's all kinds of opportunities to walk more, bike more, bus more, because the transportation sector in Canada is a quarter of the problem. Our sources of power, sources of energy, are another quarter. Industry is another quarter. And then residential and commercial buildings and the other associated human activities are the remaining quarter of that paradigm.
And just in a final kind of recap then, and you are the Executive Director of the David Suzuki Foundation, so you are obviously highly committed to finding solutions. So how do people sort of get in touch or get involved with you? I mean, like, involved in the education process and that kind of thing?
Well, we rely very heavily on volunteers, and we're going to be doing 9 projects in the coming year on climate change, and we'll need people to do that. They can phone us at 732-4228, or they can write to us right here in Vancouver at number 219-2211 West 4th, Vancouver.
Right, and so in other words, so people can get involved and learn more or participate and do whatever they can to help out.
They can come in and work on the projects, or they can come and talk to us about what kinds of things can they do as individuals. We're going to have a challenge program. We're going to be challenging British Columbians to park their vehicle 3 days a week. They'll get a sticker on the car and a sticker at home, and they can say, I'm committed to doing something. I know what cars are doing, and that way we can bring pressure on the automotive industry to start bringing out cars that have non-fossil fuel using motors.
And it all starts with each one of us. I guess the challenge is up to me. Anyways, well, thank you so much, Jim, for being a guest here on Pressure Point.
Thank you, Brad. There's lots of solutions out there, and we can make a better world.
Thank you. I've been talking with Jim Fulton, the Executive Director of the David Suzuki Foundation. We've been talking about climate change. Thanks for joining us on Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe.
The preceding program was produced through the facilities of Rogers Community 4, Vancouver. We want to hear from you and invite you to leave your comments and suggestions on our 24-hour response line message machine. Please call 731-5812.